The world of languages had always been a playground for the famous polyglot, a man celebrated across continents for his unparalleled mastery of over 40 tongues. He had built a reputation as a linguistic prodigy, someone who could listen to a dialect once and echo it flawlessly. Universities invited him to lecture, governments consulted him for translations, and media houses showcased his remarkable abilities. But for all his brilliance, he carried the arrogance of a man who believed there was nothing left for him to learn. His latest project involved a nearly forgotten language, one buried deep within the annals of African oral history, a dialect scholars had failed to decode for generations. He was certain that he alone could resurrect it, that no one else could even begin to understand its cryptic structure. Yet fate had a quiet plan waiting in the background. Hidden behind the soft footsteps of a maid's young daughter who listened more than she spoke, the maid worked in his grand estate, a sprawling mansion filled with books and echoes of distant civilizations. Every morning, she arrived with her daughter, a reserved girl who preferred to linger in the corners of the study, eyes scanning the spines of dusty tomes. She was no older than 16, her hair tied back neatly, her manner polite yet distant. The polyglot barely noticed her, save for the occasional nod or fleeting glance. To him, she was a child from a world far removed from his someone whose existence blended into the background noise of his scholarly pursuits. He was too absorbed in the challenge of deciphering the ancient scripts, sprawled across parchment that had been sent to him from a remote excavation site. The symbols were intricate, their phonetic patterns defying logic. His frustration grew as his linguistic theories failed to align with the text before him. Days turned into weeks, and each night, he muttered curses at the indecipherable scroll, unaware that someone else in the room quietly understood what he could not. It began one afternoon when the maid's daughter lingered longer than usual, her gaze fixed on the parchment spread across the mahogany desk. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing as if tracing something familiar. The polyglot caught the glance and, with a hint of irritation, snapped, asking if she had never seen a real manuscript before. She hesitated before softly replying that she recognized some of the symbols. Amused by her claim, he invited her closer, convinced it would provide him a moment of amusement. He pointed to a sequence of characters, expecting her to falter. Instead, she whispered a phrase under her breath, a string of sounds so fluid and precise that the polyglot froze. It was the first coherent sequence he had ever heard in the language. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. He blinked, uncertain whether he had misheard. The girl repeated the words, her tone calm, her eyes steady. Something stirred in his chest, a mix of disbelief and awe. How could this child, the daughter of his maid, know what generations of linguists had failed to grasp? He asked her how she knew, and she shrugged, explaining that her grandmother used to tell stories in a tongue much like the one on the paper. She had listened as a child, fascinated by the rhythm of the words, unaware that she was absorbing something rare and ancient. The polyglot's hands trembled slightly as he pushed more parchments toward her, each one containing fragments of text he had struggled to decode. She moved through them effortlessly, her eyes darting across symbols as her lips murmured translations that aligned perfectly with the context he had been theorizing for months. Every sentence she spoke shattered a wall he had built in his own mind, the belief that knowledge was confined to scholars, that genius required prestige or education. He felt the ground shift beneath him. Not out of jealousy but wonder, he began testing her further, drawing on other obscure languages he had mastered. He wrote phrases in Swahili, Amharic, Xhosa, even fragments of ancient Egyptian Coptic, and to his astonishment, she recognized patterns, rhythms, and linguistic echoes between them. Her mind mapped languages instinctively, connecting roots and tonal shifts the way a musician recognizes melodies. She wasn't translating by memory. She was decoding through intuition. Her grasp of phonetic logic, cultural metaphor, and morphological structure was beyond natural. It was innate brilliance. The polyglot felt an unfamiliar humility wash over him as he realized that her understanding came not from books or academia but from listening, absorbing, and feeling the pulse of words as living things. She understood language not as a system but as a soul. In the following days, he found himself drawn to her insights, abandoning his pride to learn how she thought. She explained that she could sense the emotions behind words, that languages spoke through rhythm before meaning. He listened, entranced, watching as she articulated concepts linguists took decades to formalize. He had spent his life collecting languages, yet she carried them effortlessly in her blood. There was a purity to her perception that stripped language of its scholarly barriers, revealing it as something deeply human and universal. He realized that while he studied language as an artifact, she lived it as an inheritance. Word of her ability began to spread quietly among his peers. At first, they dismissed it as exaggeration until he invited them to witness it themselves. She sat before professors and scholars, reading from manuscripts no one could interpret, and each time, her translations proved astonishingly accurate. The experts exchanged skeptical glances, but her consistency silenced them. They tested her with varying texts, shifting scripts, even invented symbols to trick her intuition, yet she moved through each test with the same serene confidence. The polyglot watched with pride, mixed with awe, as the world that once dismissed her, Mother now bowed before her daughter's mind. He felt a profound sense of irony, that the greatest linguistic discovery of his career came not from his intellect, but from the unnoticed genius sweeping his floors in private. He often reflected on how close he had come to missing her brilliance entirely. How many times had he dismissed her presence as trivial, her quietness as shyness, her eyes on the books as childish curiosity? The realization gnawed at him, not out of guilt but enlightenment. Genius, he thought, was never confined to status or privilege. It bloomed wherever the soil of curiosity was fertile. The maid's daughter had taught him something no university ever could, that the world's rarest treasures often hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to recognize their language. News of the girl's extraordinary linguistic gift spread far beyond the polyglot's estate, rippling across academic circles, cultural societies, and the media like a storm no one had anticipated. At first it was dismissed as a rumor, the kind of embellished tale that scholars loved to mock, the idea that a maid's daughter, with no formal education, had managed to decode a dead language that experts couldn't even categorize. But soon, videos began to surface of her sitting beside the famed polyglot, calmly translating fragments of text while professors and linguists watched in stunned silence. Her voice carried a quiet confidence, unshaken by the weight of the audience before her. Every word she spoke was deliberate, precise, and layered with understanding that transcended translation. She wasn't just interpreting words, she was resurrecting meaning, reviving sounds that hadn't been heard in centuries. As if the past itself recognized her as one of its own, the academic world found itself divided. Some hailed her as a prodigy, a living bridge between eras of lost civilizations and modern understanding. Others, threatened by her existence, called her a hoax, a lucky guesser guided by the polyglot's cues. But the more she spoke, the harder it became to deny her genius. Universities began inviting her to speak. Researchers flew across continents to observe her, and linguists who once dismissed oral traditions as unreliable began reconsidering their assumptions. In lecture halls packed beyond capacity, she would sit modestly at the front, hands folded on her lap, her demeanor soft yet commanding. Professors twice her age would present her with scripts in rare dialects, and she would study them in silence for a few seconds before weaving sentences that made their meaning bloom. Every time she did, the audience would erupt in murmurs of astonishment. Cameras clicked, pens scribbled, and yet she seemed detached from the frenzy. Her mind somewhere between logic and instinct. Her mother watched from the sidelines, eyes filled with disbelief and pride. For years she had scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and endured the quiet dismissal of those who never looked beyond her uniform. Now those same people were standing in awe of her daughter. The maid never complained about her life, but she carried a quiet pain, knowing her daughter's potential had always been overshadowed by circumstance. Seeing her child seated among scholars and experts, commanding a room full of the educated elite, was something she could hardly process. The polyglot, too, found himself humbled. He no longer saw her as the quiet observer in the background, but as a force of nature, someone whose understanding of language surpassed the boundaries of structured learning. He became her advocate, ensuring she was given the platform she deserved. Though deep down he knew she needed no one to speak for her, the girl's rise to recognition wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a cultural awakening. People began to question long-held assumptions about intelligence, privilege, and opportunity. Her brilliance challenged the notion that genius must be nurtured in classrooms or certified by institutions. Here was a girl who had never attended an elite school, who learned through listening, observation, and an innate connection to heritage. She represented something deeper than academic mastery, the living proof that human intellect cannot be measured by circumstance. Scholars who once prided themselves on analytical frameworks now found themselves studying her process, trying to understand how she did what she did. She could explain phonetic systems with uncanny accuracy. Yet when asked how she knew, her answer was always simple: she just felt it. Language, she explained, was not only learned but inherited, carried in the rhythms of songs, in the pauses of speech, in the pulse of stories told by elders. Her understanding transcended structure. She grasped the emotional blueprint of words. When reading ancient texts, she didn't just translate symbols into sentences, she reimagined the tone, the intention, the emotional gravity behind them. She could sense when a passage was a prayer or a warning, when a phrase carried sorrow or reverence. To her, words were alive, breathing through time, and her gift was the ability to listen to their heartbeat. That was what truly set her apart from the scholars. They studied language, but she communed with it. The polyglot often said she possessed the ear of the ancestors, a poetic phrase that soon found its way into headlines and documentaries. Yet even as fame surrounded her, she remained grounded, shyly turning away from praise and redirecting attention to the beauty of the languages themselves. "It's not me," she would say softly during interviews. "It's the voices that were never heard again." Finally speaking, her humility only deepened the world's fascination. She became a symbol of hidden brilliance, of the extraordinary that exists beneath invisibility. Reporters sought her story, tracing her lineage, uncovering her grandmother's oral tales that had shaped her understanding of sound and meaning. Linguistic historians began documenting her interpretations as benchmarks for reconstructing lost dialects. And soon, she was not merely a subject of study, but a collaborator in global linguistic projects. She helped researchers trace connections between African, Middle Eastern, and early Indo-European phonetics, revealing linguistic bridges that had gone unnoticed for centuries. Her mind seemed to operate on a map invisible to others, connecting dots between tonal vibrations, mouth shapes, and emotional resonance. To watch her work was like witnessing music written in words, but with fame came scrutiny. Some critics claimed she was being exploited, others accused her of fabricating results with the polyglot's help. A few academics felt threatened that their years of study were being overshadowed by a girl whose genius defied explanation, yet no amount of skepticism could dim the authenticity of her gift. Each test, each challenge, each attempt to discredit her only made her mastery more evident. Over time, those who doubted her found themselves learning from her, their arrogance dissolving into admiration. She became an icon of cultural pride, especially among those whose languages had long been dismissed as primitive or extinct. Her gift redefined the value of indigenous knowledge and reminded the world that wisdom often survives outside the walls of universities. As her recognition grew, so did her influence. She began advocating for the preservation of dying languages, traveling to villages, recording elders, and teaching linguists to listen rather than analyze. She spoke passionately about how each lost language was a piece of human history erased, a story silenced forever. The polyglot accompanied her on many of these journeys. Now more student than mentor, he watched as she spoke with native speakers in dialects they thought forgotten, rekindling emotional connections that brought tears to their eyes. It was in those moments that he fully grasped the depth of her gift, not merely intellectual, but spiritual. She was healing a rift between past and present, reuniting voices that time had scattered everywhere she went. She inspired others to look within themselves for unrecognized potential. Children who once felt small or overlooked began to dream bigger, seeing in her a reflection of possibility. Her story transcended linguistics. It became a movement, a reminder that brilliance knows no boundaries of race, class, or education. She had broken through every barrier society had built around her, and in doing so, she redefined what it meant to be a genius. To the world, she was a miracle of intellect, but to herself, she was simply a girl who listened to her mother, her grandmother, and the languages whispering through time. The encounter between the polyglot and the maid's daughter marked the beginning of an extraordinary transformation that reached far beyond either of their lives. What started as a moment of disbelief had blossomed into an unspoken bond built on curiosity, humility, and shared wonder. The polyglot, once proud and self-assured in his mastery of languages, found himself in the unfamiliar role of student. For the first time in his career, he sat beside someone who not only equaled his understanding, but surpassed it with an effortless grace that defied explanation. He watched her work in silence, her eyes scanning texts with a calm focus, her lips moving just enough to whisper the sounds of languages that hadn't been heard in centuries. It wasn't mere translation, it was resurrection. Each word she spoke seemed to breathe life into history, restoring meaning to the forgotten voices of ancient storytellers. Priests and poets the world had taken notice of her gift, but for her, fame was an echo in the background. What mattered most was learning, discovering, and understanding the human heart behind every language. She had become a global sensation, yet in private, she remained the same thoughtful, curious girl who found beauty in words others ignored. The polyglot, seeing her humility, began to reflect on his own arrogance. He realized how easily he had dismissed people like her mother, those who lived quiet lives without acknowledgement or applause. He thought about how knowledge, when confined to pride, became hollow. In her, he saw knowledge as something pure, something meant to connect rather than separate. Slowly, the relationship between them evolved from teacher and student to collaborators, and then, to something resembling kindred souls bound by a shared pursuit of truth. Together, they embarked on a mission that would change the field of linguistics forever. They began compiling a compendium of endangered languages, working tirelessly to document dialects on the brink of extinction. The girl would listen to old recordings, the faint crackle of voices that had long since faded, and she could reconstruct the syntax, tone, and grammar with uncanny precision. The polyglot would marvel at her process, noting how she would close her eyes and let the sounds guide her intuition. She explained that every language carried emotion, that even the smallest pause or inflection could reveal the speaker's intent. She understood languages not as codes to be broken, but as living beings that carried the memories of those who spoke them. Her empathy was her greatest strength, and through it, she uncovered truths that science had overlooked. Their work attracted the attention of cultural organizations and universities worldwide. Invitations poured in for joint lectures, research projects, and cultural preservation initiatives. The polyglot, who once basked in the spotlight alone, now proudly introduced her as his equal. He often watched audiences fall silent as she spoke, her voice filled with the warmth of understanding that transcended intellect. She spoke of language as humanity's first bridge, the thread that connected all people, regardless of race or history. When she translated forgotten hymns or recited ancient proverbs, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if time itself had paused to listen. Even the most skeptical scholars found themselves moved, not just by her talent, but by the sincerity behind it. She wasn't performing, she was honoring the voices of those who came before in the midst of this success. She never forgot her roots. She continued to live with her mother, refusing to move into luxury despite the wealth and opportunities offered to her. The maid, once invisible in the grand mansion, now walked with quiet pride, knowing that her daughter's brilliance had rewritten their story. The polyglot often visited them, not as a master, but as a friend, sitting at their modest kitchen table, sipping tea as the girl read aloud from new discoveries. He would listen, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply enjoying the rhythm of her words. In those moments he felt the essence of what he had been searching for his entire life, not the mastery of language, but the connection it created between souls. As their collaboration deepened, the girl's work began influencing new generations of linguists. Young students from around the world reached out to her, inspired by her story and driven to preserve their own heritage languages. She encouraged them to listen to their elders, to pay attention to the music of speech, the subtle changes in tone that carried meaning deeper than any grammar book could capture. Her teachings became a philosophy that true understanding comes from listening, not analyzing. The polyglot documented their findings in a new book, but he insisted that her name appear first on the cover. It was his way of honoring the truth that she had not only expanded his knowledge but reshaped his understanding of what it meant to be a linguist. Their partnership also began to change the polyglot personally. The arrogance that once defined him slowly dissolved, replaced by reverence for the simplicity of learning through humility. He often found himself remembering the first day she spoke that ancient phrase, the moment that shattered his pride and opened his mind. Now, whenever he lectured or wrote, he carried that lesson with him. He spoke openly about how brilliance could come from anywhere, that intellect was not born from privilege but from passion. He credited her not just with reviving a lost language, but with reviving his sense of wonder. For her, his acknowledgement was unnecessary. She saw him as the one who had given her the space to grow, to share her voice with the world. Together they had built something greater than recognition. They had built understanding, but even as the world celebrated them, they both sensed that their journey was far from over. New manuscripts arrived daily. Languages once thought extinct resurfaced through oral traditions, and communities invited them to help preserve their linguistic legacies. The girl approached each project with the same quiet excitement, her eyes lighting up when she recognized patterns hidden beneath symbols. She had a gift for making the complex seem simple, turning the study of language into something alive and human again. People began to describe her work as more art than science, a kind of spiritual decoding that bridged centuries. Wherever she went, she left behind not only knowledge but hope. Hope that the past could still speak, that nothing truly forgotten was ever lost if someone cared enough to listen. The polyglot often reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since meeting her. He had spent years chasing mastery, only to discover that real wisdom began where pride ended. Watching her work reminded him of the first spark that had drawn him to languages as a boy, the curiosity, the fascination, the joy of discovery. Now, through her, that spark burned brighter than ever. Together, they had proven that knowledge was not the possession of the privileged, but a gift that could arise from any soul willing to listen deeply enough. And though he had once been the one everyone turned to for answers, he now found his greatest fulfillment in learning beside her, in being part of something that transcended both of them, the eternal conversation between humanity and its words.